December 18th, 1991, Harris County, Texas. The night air hung heavy over a small gas station on Route 90, 15 miles outside Houston. This unremarkable roadside stop, surrounded by empty fields and the occasional truck rumbling past, would become the center of one of the county's most perplexing missing persons cases. Robert Coleman, 34 years old, and his wife Jennifer, 29, owned and operated the Coleman service station for nearly 6 years. The couple had built a modest life around the business, working long hours to serve the truckers and travelers who passed through this desolate stretch of highway. Those who knew them described a hard-working pair, dedicated to their dream of eventual expansion into a small chain of stations across the region. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. On that cold December evening, Robert and Jennifer worked the night shift together, as they often did. The station closed at midnight, but the couple typically stayed later to balance the register and prepare for the next day. Their routine had become predictable, almost mechanical in its consistency. At 6:30 the following morning, employee Daniel Harris arrived for his opening shift. What he discovered would launch an investigation that would span decades. The station's front door stood wide open, the interior lights blazing against the gray dawn. The cash register sat ajar, bills still visible inside. A half-empty coffee cup rested on the counter, still faintly warm to the touch. Robert's jacket hung on its usual hook near the back office. But Robert and Jennifer Coleman were gone. Daniel immediately contacted the authorities. Harris County Sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes, securing the scene and beginning their preliminary investigation. The initial assessment revealed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. The money in the register remained untouched, approximately $800 in bills and coins. Robert's truck sat in its designated parking spot behind the building, keys still in the ignition. Detective Timothy Walsh, a 15-year veteran of the department, took charge of the case. His methodical approach to the scene uncovered several peculiarities. A logbook near the register showed that the last customer transaction occurred at 11:18 the previous night, yet the lights remained on and the door remained unlocked for hours afterward. In the small back office, Jennifer's purse sat on the desk, her wallet and identification inside. Her winter coat hung beside her husband's jacket. The absence of personal belongings struck investigators as significant. People planning to leave voluntarily typically took essential items: money, identification, warm clothing. The Colemans appeared to have simply vanished mid-routine, as if called away by something urgent and unexpected. Family members arrived at the station throughout the morning, their confusion matching that of the investigators. Robert's brother William described his sibling as responsible and routine-oriented, someone who would never abandon his business without notice. Jennifer's sister Michelle insisted the couple had been happy, with no marital problems or financial pressures that might drive them to disappear. Detective Walsh expanded the investigation to include interviews with regular customers, other business owners along the highway, and anyone who might have passed the station during the critical hours between 11 at night and 6 in the morning. The responses yielded frustratingly little. One trucker recalled stopping for gas around 10:30, describing the couple as pleasant and unremarkable. Another driver mentioned passing the station near midnight, noticing the lights on, but seeing no one inside. As the first day of investigation drew to a close, Walsh made a discovery that would later prove crucial, though its significance wouldn't be understood for nearly a quarter-century. The station had installed a security camera system 6 months earlier, a single VHS recording device aimed at the front counter and entrance. Walsh requested the tape from the night of December 18th. The station manager's office contained the VHS recorder, but the tape slot stood empty. A thorough search of the premises revealed no security tapes anywhere on site. Either the system hadn't been recording that night, or someone had removed the evidence before investigators arrived. This absence of video footage troubled Walsh deeply. In his experience, missing evidence often pointed to intentional concealment. But who would have taken the tape, and when? The security system's indicator light showed it had been functioning normally. The device had been actively recording until someone physically removed the tape. As darkness fell on December 19th, Robert and Jennifer Coleman had been missing for over 24 hours. The initial 48-hour window, considered critical in missing persons investigations, was rapidly closing. Without evidence of foul play, without witnesses, without any clear indication of where the couple might have gone or why, the investigation faced significant obstacles from its very beginning. What investigators didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine on that second day, was that the answer to this mystery lay not in what they could see, but in what had already been taken from them. The missing security tape contained the truth, and that truth would remain hidden in an evidence box for 24 years before anyone would finally look closely enough to see what had really happened on that cold December night. The Coleman case had only just begun, and the darkest revelations still lay decades in the future, waiting in the shadows of an overlooked piece of evidence. The weeks following the disappearance of Robert and Jennifer Coleman brought a flurry of investigative activity that ultimately led nowhere. Detective Timothy Walsh devoted countless hours to the case, following every potential lead, interviewing dozens of witnesses, and pursuing theories that ranged from voluntary disappearance to kidnapping to murder. Each avenue of investigation seemed promising at first, only to collapse under scrutiny. By January 1992, Walsh had assembled a detailed profile of the missing couple. Financial records showed no unusual activity in the days leading up to their disappearance. The Colemans maintained modest bank accounts with steady deposits from the gas station's revenue. Their mortgage payments remained current. Credit card statements revealed ordinary purchases: groceries, utilities, business supplies. Nothing suggested they were planning to flee or facing financial ruin. The couple's personal relationships appeared equally stable. Friends described Robert as quiet and hardworking, dedicated to building his business. Jennifer, more outgoing than her husband, had maintained close ties with her family and a small circle of friends. Phone records from their home showed regular calls to relatives and business contacts, all routine in nature. The last call Jennifer made was to her sister Michelle on December 17th, a brief conversation about Christmas plans. Detective Walsh interviewed employees of the gas station, hoping to uncover workplace conflicts or suspicious behavior. Daniel Harris, who discovered the scene, had worked for the Colemans for 2 years and spoke highly of them as employers. Another part-time employee, Sarah Chen, described the couple as fair and consistent. Neither employee could identify anyone who might wish the Colemans harm. The investigation took a significant turn in February when Jennifer's sister Michelle revealed information the family had kept private. Jennifer had been approximately 3 months pregnant at the time of her disappearance. The couple had shared this news only with immediate family, planning to make a broader announcement after the first trimester. This revelation added another layer of tragedy to the case and raised new questions about motive. Walsh theorized that the pregnancy might have triggered the disappearance. Perhaps the couple faced some threat related to the unborn child. Perhaps someone opposed to the pregnancy had acted violently. But these theories found no supporting evidence. Everyone who knew about Jennifer's condition expressed joy at the news. The couple had been trying to conceive for over a year and viewed the pregnancy as a blessing. As winter turned to spring, the investigation expanded to surrounding counties and eventually across state lines. Missing persons bulletins circulated throughout Texas and neighboring states. The Colemans' photographs appeared in newspapers and on television news programs. Tips flooded the sheriff's department, each one requiring investigation and verification. A reported sighting in Louisiana proved to be a different couple entirely. An anonymous caller claimed to have seen the Colemans boarding a bus to Mexico, but video footage from the station showed no one matching their descriptions. A gas station attendant in Oklahoma insisted Jennifer had stopped for fuel, but the woman turned out to be a tourist from Canada. Every lead dissolved into false hope and wasted resources. In May 1992, Detective Walsh uncovered a detail that briefly reignited the investigation. Bank records showed that Robert had withdrawn $5,000 in cash from their business account on December 15th, 3 days before the disappearance. The withdrawal, while not illegal or necessarily suspicious, represented an unusually large sum for the couple. Walsh questioned bank employees about the transaction. Robert had arrived alone, requested the cash without explanation, and left quickly. The teller remembered nothing remarkable about his demeanor. The cash withdrawal opened new investigative possibilities. Had Robert been paying off a debt? Meeting a blackmail demand? Preparing to flee? Walsh traced the couple's activities in the days following the withdrawal, but found no corresponding expenditures or deposits elsewhere. The $5,000 had simply vanished, along with the couple themselves. By the end of 1992, the active investigation had slowed considerably. Walsh continued to follow up on occasional tips and maintained regular contact with the Coleman family. But the trail had gone cold. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without any clear indication of what had happened that December night, the case settled into the frustrating category of unsolved disappearances. Years passed, with no developments. Detective Walsh retired in 2003, 12 years after taking on the Coleman case. Before leaving the department, he organized all the case files, evidence, and notes, hoping that fresh eyes might someday see what he had missed. The case officially moved to the Cold Case Archives, joining hundreds of other unsolved investigations in the county's records. The Coleman family never stopped searching. Jennifer's sister, Michelle, hired private investigators, distributed flyers, and maintained a website dedicated to finding answers. Robert's brother, William, offered rewards for information. But as the years stretched from one decade into two, hope faded into resignation. The family held memorial services in 2001, 10 years after the disappearance, acknowledging that Robert and Jennifer were likely deceased, even without proof. By 2010, the Coleman case existed primarily as a cautionary tale shared among local law enforcement, an example of how quickly an investigation can lose momentum without solid evidence. Newer detectives might hear the story in passing, another cold case in a file room full of unsolved mysteries. What none of them knew, what couldn't be known until technology and circumstance aligned years later, was that the answer had been there all along, sitting in an evidence box in a basement storage room. The truth about December 18, 1991, waited patiently in the form of magnetic tape, preserved but forgotten, holding secrets that would eventually shatter everything the family believed they knew about that night. The investigation wasn't over. It had simply been paused, waiting for the moment when someone would look at old evidence with new eyes and see what had always been there, hidden in plain sight on a security recording that almost no one knew existed. March 2015. Harris County Sheriff's Department headquarters underwent extensive renovation, a modernization project designed to bring the aging facility into the 21st century. Construction crews gutted outdated offices, replaced ancient wiring, and converted paper-based systems to digital archives. In the basement, where decades of evidence and cold case files had accumulated in forgotten storage rooms, workers began the laborious task of cataloging and relocating materials. Detective Sarah Mitchell, 38 years old and recently assigned to the cold case unit, supervised the evidence transfer. The department had hired her specifically to bring fresh perspective to unsolved investigations, leveraging new forensic technologies and investigative techniques that hadn't existed when many of these cases first went cold. Mitchell approached her work with methodical precision, reviewing each box, each file, each piece of evidence as it passed through the relocation process. On March 23rd, a construction worker emerged from a particularly cluttered corner of the basement, carrying a water-damaged cardboard box marked with faded handwriting. The label read, "Coleman Investigation, December 1991. Mitchell recognized the case name immediately from her preliminary review of the department's unsolved disappearances. The Coleman case represented one of the county's most persistent mysteries, a couple who had simply vanished without explanation or evidence. The box contained the expected materials, witness statements, photographs of the gas station, financial records, interview notes compiled by Detective Walsh over years of investigation. But nestled at the bottom, wrapped in a deteriorating evidence bag, Mitchell found something unexpected. A VHS tape, its label barely legible, dated December 18, 1991. A security recording from the night the Colemans disappeared. Mitchell's pulse quickened as she examined the tape. According to Walsh's case notes, the security system at the Coleman service station had been recording that night, but the tape was never found at the scene. The assumption had always been that the system malfunctioned, or that someone removed the evidence before police arrived. Yet here sat the tape, logged into evidence, forgotten in storage for nearly a quarter-century. The detective immediately requisitioned specialized equipment to view the aging VHS recording. Modern playback devices were hard to find, but the department maintained connections with a digital forensics lab that specialized in recovering data from obsolete media formats. Within days, technicians had transferred the VHS content to digital format, enhancing and stabilizing the degraded footage. Mitchell watched the recording in a darkened conference room, her attention focused on the grainy black-and-white images flickering across the screen. The camera angle captured the gas station's front counter and entrance, offering a clear view of the interior space and a partial view of the parking area outside. Timestamps in the corner marked each frame, counting through the hours of December 18th. The early evening footage showed routine activity. Robert appeared behind the counter, processing transactions, restocking cigarettes, maintaining the ordinary rhythm of a quiet night. Jennifer moved in and out of frame, occasionally joining her husband at the register, sometimes disappearing into the back office. A handful of customers came and went, their faces briefly visible before they returned to their vehicles and drove away. As the timestamp approached 11 o'clock, the station's activity decreased. Fewer vehicles stopped for gas. The last visible customer transaction occurred at 11:18, matching the logbook entry found at the scene. After that moment, Robert and Jennifer appeared alone in the station, going about their closing routine. Mitchell leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen as the timestamp moved past 11:30. For several minutes, nothing changed. Robert counted money at the register. Jennifer emerged from the back office carrying what appeared to be a small bag or purse. Then, at 11:42, something happened that made Mitchell stop the playback and rewind. A dark vehicle pulled into the parking area. But instead of stopping at the gas pumps, it parked at the edge of the frame, just beyond the camera's optimal viewing angle. The vehicle remained there, headlights off, barely visible in the shadows. Mitchell could make out only a portion of the car, not enough to identify the make or model, and certainly not enough to see who sat inside. For 2 minutes, nothing happened. The vehicle sat motionless in the darkness while Robert and Jennifer continued their activities inside the station, apparently unaware of its presence. Then Robert looked up, as if hearing something or noticing the vehicle for the first time. He said something to Jennifer, though the security system recorded no audio. Jennifer nodded and disappeared into the back office briefly before returning. At 11:45, Robert walked to the station's entrance, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. The camera angle showed him moving toward the dark vehicle, his posture suggesting familiarity rather than caution. He walked with purpose, not hesitation. This was not a frightened man approaching a stranger. This was someone meeting an acquaintance, perhaps even a friend. Jennifer appeared in the doorway seconds later, now carrying what clearly looked like a small overnight bag. She followed her husband toward the vehicle, glancing back at the station once before moving out of the camera's range. For 30 seconds, Mitchell watched an empty gas station, its lights blazing, the register still open on the counter. Then the dark vehicle's taillights flared briefly in the shadows, and it pulled away, disappearing beyond the camera's field of view. Robert and Jennifer Coleman were gone. Mitchell sat in silence, processing what she had witnessed. The footage contradicted almost everything investigators had assumed about the case. The Colemans hadn't been abducted. They hadn't fled in panic. They had left voluntarily with someone they knew, carrying luggage, apparently planning to be gone for some period of time. Yet they never returned, never contacted their family, never reclaimed their business or their lives. The detective rewound the footage, focusing on the dark vehicle. Using enhancement software, she isolated frames showing the car's rear end, trying to make out any identifying details. The angle was poor and the lighting worse, but after hours of work, she managed to extract a partial view of the license plate. 3 letters were clearly visible, possibly 4. It wasn't much, but it was more than investigators had possessed for the previous 24 years. Mitchell ran the partial plate through the department's database, cross-referencing with vehicles registered in Harris County and surrounding areas in 1991. The search returned hundreds of possible matches, but the detective began the tedious process of elimination, narrowing the list based on vehicle type, color, and ownership records. After 3 days of intensive work, one name emerged from the data with disturbing frequency: Michael Patterson, age 41 in 1991, had owned a dark blue sedan matching the general profile of the vehicle in the footage. More significantly, Patterson's name appeared elsewhere in the Coleman case file. He had been interviewed briefly by Detective Walsh in January 1992 as part of the broad canvassing of local business owners. Patterson managed a private armored transport company that occasionally serviced the Coleman service station, picking up large cash deposits for bank delivery. The connection was too specific to ignore. Mitchell pulled every available record on Michael Patterson, constructing a timeline of his life and activities. What she discovered sent the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated, toward answers that had waited in darkness for more than 2 decades, and toward a truth far more disturbing than a simple disappearance. The grainy security footage had revealed its first secret, but Mitchell sensed it held more, hidden in those shadowy frames where a dark vehicle waited and 2 people walked willingly toward whatever fate had claimed them on that December night. April 2015. The Harris County Forensic Laboratory dedicated significant resources to extracting every possible detail from the restored security footage. Detective Sarah Mitchell worked closely with digital imaging specialists, pushing the limits of enhancement technology to reveal what the original VHS tape had captured in such poor lighting and resolution. Frame-by-frame analysis of the dark vehicle yielded incremental progress. Specialists managed to isolate 7 distinct frames showing portions of the rear license plate at various angles. By combining and cross-referencing these fragments, they constructed a complete plate number. The vehicle belonged to Michael Patterson, registered to a business address in Northwest Houston. Mitchell immediately began investigating Patterson's background and his connection to the Colemans. Department of Motor Vehicles records confirmed he had owned the dark sedan from 1989 through 1994 when he sold it to a dealership. The vehicle had since been scrapped, eliminating any possibility of forensic examination. Patterson himself had died in 2008 from heart failure, according to death certificates Mitchell obtained from county records. The detective turned her attention to Patterson's business dealings. His company, Secure Transport Solutions, provided armored car services to small businesses throughout the Houston area. The Coleman service station appeared on client lists dating back to 1989. Patterson's crews picked up cash deposits twice weekly, a routine service for gas stations handling significant amounts of currency. This business relationship explained why Robert Coleman would have recognized Patterson's vehicle and approached it without hesitation. The 2 men had interacted regularly for years, establishing familiarity and presumably trust. But this connection raised more questions than it answered. Why would Patterson arrive at the gas station late at night, outside normal business hours? Why would the Colemans leave with him voluntarily? And most critically, what had happened after they drove away? Mitchell subpoenaed Patterson's business records, a process complicated by the fact that Secure Transport Solutions had ceased operations in 2009, shortly after Patterson's death. The company's assets had been liquidated, its client lists sold to competitors, its financial records archived in storage facilities. Recovering these documents required weeks of legal maneuvering and physical searching through boxes of deteriorating paperwork. When the records finally arrived, they painted an intriguing picture. In late 1991, Patterson's company had experienced unusual financial activity. Large deposits appeared in the business accounts during November and December, amounts far exceeding the company's typical revenue. The deposits came from offshore accounts, their origins obscured by layers of international banking transactions. More significantly, in January 1992, just weeks after the Colemans disappeared, Patterson had made substantial purchases: a new vehicle, upgrades to his home, investment property in West Texas. The timing seemed beyond coincidental. Mitchell calculated the approximate value of these acquisitions and found they corresponded roughly to several $100,000 in additional income, money that appeared to have no legitimate source in Patterson's business operations. The detective expanded her investigation to Patterson's personal life. She located his former wife, Catherine, who had divorced him in 1995. The woman agreed to meet with Mitchell at a coffee shop in suburban Houston, nervous but willing to discuss her ex-husband after learning about the investigation. Catherine described Patterson as ambitious and often secretive about his business affairs. Their marriage had deteriorated as he became increasingly involved with questionable financial dealings. She suspected he was laundering money through his transport company, using legitimate armored car operations as cover for moving illegal funds. When she confronted him about suspicious transactions in 1994, he became defensive and threatening. She filed for divorce shortly afterward. Most crucially, Catherine remembered December 1991 distinctly. Patterson had been tense and preoccupied throughout that month, making unusual late-night trips and receiving mysterious phone calls. In mid-December, he mentioned needing to resolve a business problem that had become complicated. After the holidays, his mood shifted dramatically. He seemed relieved, almost euphoric, and suddenly had access to significant cash he claimed came from a successful business deal. Mitchell pressed for more specific details. Catherine recalled seeing a small overnight bag in Patterson's car during late December, similar to what Jennifer Coleman had carried in the security footage. She also remembered Patterson taking an unexpected trip to his West Texas property immediately after Christmas, despite having told her he planned to spend the holidays at home. The West Texas property demanded investigation. Mitchell obtained the address from old property records and discovered that Patterson had purchased the remote acreage in 1987, describing it as a potential vacation retreat. The land sat in an isolated area of Culberson County, hundreds of miles from Houston, accessed by poorly maintained rural roads. Patterson had built a small cabin on the property, but rarely used it, according to neighbors Mitchell interviewed by phone. The detective secured authorization to visit the property, now owned by a ranching company that had purchased it from Patterson's estate. She made the 8-hour drive west with 2 other investigators and a cadaver dog handler, prepared for what they might discover on the isolated land. The property covered 40 acres of rough terrain, dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. The cabin had fallen into disrepair, its roof partially collapsed, its windows broken. The dog handler released his trained animal, watching as it ranged across the property, searching for the scent signature of human remains. Within 30 minutes, the dog alerted near a collapsed outbuilding behind the cabin. The handler confirmed the signal, and investigators marked the location. A second search area drew the dog's attention closer to the cabin itself, beneath what had once been a wooden deck. The animal's behavior suggested the presence of human remains in both locations. Mitchell contacted the local sheriff's department and requested a full forensic excavation team. Within 2 days, specialists arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment to confirm the dog's findings before beginning the delicate process of excavation. The radar revealed anomalies consistent with human burial in both locations the dog had identified. The excavation proceeded carefully, with forensic archaeologists documenting each layer of soil removed. At the first site, 3 feet below the surface, they uncovered fabric fragments and bone. The second site yielded similar findings at approximately the same depth. Both burial sites showed evidence of having been disturbed and refilled decades earlier. The soil compaction and vegetation growth consistent with interment in the early 1990s. The remains were carefully extracted and transported to the county medical examiner's office for analysis. Initial examination confirmed they were human, 2 individuals, 1 male and 1 female. Dental records provided definitive identification within 48 hours. The remains belonged to Robert and Jennifer Coleman, missing for 23 years, buried in the remote West Texas property owned by the man whose vehicle they had entered willingly on that December night in 1991. Forensic analysis revealed the cause of death for both victims. Each had suffered fatal injuries consistent with gunfire, though the exact circumstances remained unclear from skeletal evidence alone. The position of the remains suggested they had been buried soon after death, sometime in late December 1991 or early January 1992. Mitchell stood at the excavation site as the sun set over the desolate landscape, piecing together the terrible sequence of events. Patterson had used his business relationship with the Colemans to lure them away from their gas station, promising something compelling enough to make them leave willingly with an overnight bag. He had driven them to this isolated property, far from any witnesses, and killed them both. Then he had buried their bodies and returned to Houston to continue his life as if nothing had happened. But the detective knew this reconstruction was incomplete. Patterson's motive remained unclear, as did the specific circumstances that led to murder. The $5,000 Robert had withdrawn days before the disappearance. The offshore accounts funding Patterson's sudden wealth. The reason the Colemans had trusted Patterson enough to leave with him voluntarily. All these elements suggested a larger story, a conspiracy that had ended in double murder. Most disturbing of all was the realization that Patterson had died peacefully in 2008, never facing justice for his crimes, never revealing what had actually happened on that remote property. The truth had died with him, or so it seemed. Mitchell suspected there had to be someone else involved, someone who had helped Patterson carry out the murders or cover them up, someone who might still be alive and living with the knowledge of what had been done. The security footage had revealed the beginning of the story. The excavation had uncovered its tragic ending, but the middle remained hidden, waiting in shadows that Mitchell was determined to illuminate, no matter how long it took or what darkness she might find there. June 2015. The discovery of Robert and Jennifer Coleman's remains transformed a cold case into an active homicide investigation. Detective Sarah Mitchell assembled a task force dedicated to uncovering the complete truth behind the murders, focusing on identifying anyone who might have assisted Michael Patterson or possessed knowledge of his crimes. The investigation centered on Patterson's business operations and personal associations during the critical period of late 1991 and early 1992. Mitchell obtained court orders to access phone records from that era, a challenging process given the age of the data and the multiple telecommunications company mergers that had occurred over 2 decades. Eventually, archived records revealed frequent calls between Patterson's business line and a number registered to Christopher Webb, listed as Patterson's business partner in Secure Transport Solutions. Webb had maintained a lower profile than Patterson in the company's operations. Corporate filings showed he owned 30% of the business and served as operations manager, handling logistics and client relations while Patterson managed finances and strategic planning. When Secure Transport Solutions dissolved in 2009, Webb had moved to Arizona and started a small security consulting firm. Mitchell traced Webb's current location to Scottsdale, where he lived in a modest condominium and operated his one-person consulting business. At 63 years old, Webb appeared to have led an unremarkable life since leaving Texas. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no obvious connections to illegal activity. But his close association with Patterson during the relevant time period made him a person of interest worth investigating. The detective coordinated with Arizona law enforcement to conduct surveillance on Webb before approaching him directly. For 2 weeks, investigators monitored his routines, documenting his movements and contacts. Webb lived alone, maintained few social connections, and displayed habits suggesting someone who preferred isolation and predictability. His consulting business generated minimal income, yet his financial records showed assets inconsistent with his modest earnings, suggesting accumulated wealth from an earlier source. Mitchell decided to approach Webb directly, rather than request his voluntary cooperation from a distance. She flew to Arizona with another investigator, prepared to conduct what might be a crucial interview or possibly make an arrest, depending on what Webb revealed. They arrived at Webb's condominium on a Thursday morning in late June. Webb answered the door cautiously, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition as Mitchell displayed her credentials and explained she was investigating the Coleman murders. His reaction was telling. He didn't ask what murders she meant or express surprise that she had traveled from Texas. Instead, he simply nodded and invited them inside, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. The conversation that followed unfolded carefully, with Webb initially claiming limited knowledge of Patterson's activities outside normal business operations. But as Mitchell presented evidence piece by piece, the security footage, the financial records, the offshore accounts, the burial site, Webb's resistance crumbled. He seemed almost relieved to finally discuss what he had carried in silence for over 2 decades. Webb described how Patterson had recruited him into a money laundering scheme in 1989, using their armored transport company to move illegal funds for criminal organizations. The operation had been profitable and initially seemed low risk. They created false documentation for cash pickups that never occurred, deposited dirty money as if it came from legitimate clients, and took a percentage as their fee. By 1991, however, The scheme had attracted unwanted attention. Robert Coleman, managing the gas station's finances with careful attention to detail, had noticed discrepancies in the Armored Car Service's documentation. Cash pickup amounts didn't match his records. Dates and times were occasionally wrong. Coleman had confronted Patterson about these inconsistencies in early December, not accusing him of anything criminal, but simply seeking clarification. Patterson had panicked. If Coleman pursued the matter or contacted authorities, the entire operation would unravel. Patterson convinced Coleman that the discrepancies resulted from administrative errors, but he worried that the gas station owner would eventually recognize the pattern and realize the truth. Patterson decided Coleman posed an unacceptable risk. Webb claimed he had argued against violence, suggesting they could simply end the money laundering operation and sever ties with Coleman's station. But Patterson insisted the risk was too great. Coleman knew too much, even if he didn't yet understand what he knew. Patterson developed a plan to eliminate the threat permanently. The scheme relied on Coleman's trust. Patterson contacted Robert on December 18th, claiming he needed to discuss a lucrative business opportunity away from Houston, somewhere private where they could speak freely. He suggested his West Texas property, framing it as a potential investment opportunity that included Jennifer as well, since it involved their shared business future. The $5,000 Robert had withdrawn was intended as a good-faith investment deposit, Patterson had told him. The Colemans had believed they were meeting Patterson for a legitimate business discussion, possibly about expanding their gas station or partnering in some new venture. They packed an overnight bag, expecting to stay at Patterson's cabin and return the next day with a plan that would secure their financial future and provide for their growing family. Instead, Patterson drove them to the isolated property and shot them both shortly after arrival. Webb claimed he wasn't present during the actual murders, but Patterson had called him immediately afterward, confessing what he had done and demanding help disposing of the bodies. Webb, terrified of being implicated and already deeply involved in the criminal conspiracy, agreed to assist. Webb drove to the property the following day, bringing tools and supplies. Together, he and Patterson buried the Colemans in separate graves on the property, removing any evidence that might connect the victims to the location. They returned to Houston and resumed their normal routines, trusting that the bodies would never be found in such a remote location. The security tape had been a complication neither man anticipated. Patterson had gone to the gas station the morning after the murders, claiming he needed to pick up some documents Coleman had prepared for him. Finding the station closed and police already investigating, Patterson had quickly improvised, offering to help search the premises. During those few minutes of access, he located the VHS recorder and removed the tape, which he later placed in an evidence box during the chaos of the initial investigation, assuming it would be lost among hundreds of other items and never examined. For over 2 decades, the plan had worked. The Colemans remained missing, their disappearance a mystery that gradually faded from public attention. Patterson continued his criminal operations until increasing law enforcement pressure forced him to shut down Secure Transport Solutions. He retired, lived comfortably on his accumulated wealth, and died without ever facing consequences for his crimes. Webb had lived with the knowledge of what they had done, increasingly isolated and haunted by guilt, yet too afraid of prosecution to come forward. Mitchell's arrival had ended his long wait for accountability. The detective recorded Webb's complete confession over several hours, documenting every detail of the conspiracy, the murders, and the cover-up. Webb provided information that only someone directly involved could know, details about the burial site, the sequence of events, the conversations between him and Patterson. His account matched the physical evidence and filled in the gaps that had persisted even after the bodies were discovered. Webb acknowledged he had helped dispose of the victims and conceal evidence of their murders. He understood this made him an accessory to homicide, potentially facing life imprisonment. But after 24 years of carrying the secret, he seemed prepared to accept whatever consequences the legal system imposed. As Mitchell concluded the interview and placed Webb under arrest, she felt the weight of finally solving a case that had haunted the Harris County Sheriff's Department for nearly a quarter-century. The Coleman family would finally have complete answers. The criminal conspiracy that had taken 2 innocent lives would be fully exposed, and Christopher Webb would face the justice that Michael Patterson had escaped through death. The investigation had revealed not just a crime, but a cascade of decisions and moral failures that had destroyed multiple lives. 2 people had died because they had noticed something wrong and asked questions. Their murderer had lived freely for 17 years after killing them, and his accomplice had waited in fearful silence, knowing that eventually the truth would emerge from whatever shadows it had been hiding in. That emergence had finally come, carried forward by a forgotten security tape, modern forensic technology, and a detective who refused to let the passage of time obscure the demands of justice. August 2016. The trial of Christopher Webb for his role in the murders of Robert and Jennifer Coleman concluded in a Harris County courtroom, bringing formal closure to a case that had remained unsolved for 24 years. The proceedings had attracted significant media attention, both for the length of time that had passed since the crimes and for the unusual circumstances of their eventual solution. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Webb's participation in the criminal conspiracy and his role as an accessory to murder. The security footage, recovered from storage and digitally enhanced, showed the Colemans leaving with Patterson voluntarily, establishing the foundation of the deception that had lured them to their deaths. Forensic evidence from the burial site confirmed the victims' identities and cause of death. Financial records documented the money laundering operation that had motivated the crimes. Most critically, Webb's own detailed confession provided the narrative that connected all the evidence into a coherent account of premeditated murder and elaborate cover-up. Webb's defense attorney argued for leniency based on his client's cooperation and the fact that he had not been present during the actual killings. But prosecutors emphasized that Webb's assistance in disposing of the bodies and concealing evidence had been essential to Patterson's ability to escape justice for so long. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges of accessory to murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. 2 weeks later, the judge sentenced Christopher Webb to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for 30 years. At 64 years old, Webb would likely spend the remainder of his life in prison, finally held accountable for his role in a crime committed when he was a much younger man. For the Coleman family, the trial's conclusion brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Jennifer's sister Michelle attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the front row and listening to the detailed account of how her sister and brother-in-law had died. The family had waited 24 years for answers, and while the truth proved devastating, it was nonetheless better than the uncertainty that had defined their lives since 1991. After the sentencing, the family held a memorial service for Robert and Jennifer, finally able to lay their remains to rest with dignity and closure. The service took place at a church near the location where their gas station had once stood, attended by family members, former employees, and community members who remembered the couple. Detective Sarah Mitchell attended as well, having formed a connection with the family during the investigation. The service included remembrances of Robert and Jennifer as they had been in life, hardworking, optimistic, excited about their future together and the child they would never meet. Michelle spoke about her sister's kindness and Robert's quiet dedication. William, Robert's brother, thanked the investigators who had never given up on finding the truth, even when the case had been officially cold for over a decade. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the Coleman family's personal tragedy. The investigation revealed systemic issues in how evidence was managed and stored, leading to reforms in the Harris County Sheriff's Department's procedures. The forgotten VHS tape that had sat unexamined for 24 years prompted a comprehensive review of all cold case evidence, with particular attention to outdated media formats that might contain crucial information. Detective Mitchell received recognition for her work on the case, but she emphasized that the resolution had resulted from circumstances aligning in unexpected ways. The renovation that led to discovering the tape, the advancement in digital forensic technology that allowed proper analysis of degraded footage, the preserved records that connected Patterson to the crime. Without these elements converging, the case might have remained forever unsolved. The gas station where Robert and Jennifer Coleman had worked their last shift no longer existed. The building had been demolished years earlier, replaced by a convenience store chain that bore no connection to the couple who had once dreamed of expanding their modest business. But a small memorial plaque was installed near the location, commemorating the Colemans and acknowledging the tragedy that had occurred there. As the criminal proceedings concluded and the family began their slow process of healing, one question continued to resonate. How many other unsolved cases might find resolution through similar re-examination of old evidence with modern technology? Mitchell estimated that Harris County alone had dozens of cold cases involving outdated media formats that had never been properly analyzed. Other jurisdictions likely faced similar situations. The Coleman case demonstrated that time and technological advancement could breathe new life into investigations that seemed hopelessly stalled. DNA analysis, digital forensics, database cross-referencing, and other modern tools offered possibilities that hadn't existed when many cold cases first went dormant. The passage of years, rather than making cases unsolvable, sometimes made them newly solvable as capabilities evolved. Christopher Webb began serving his sentence at a state facility in East Texas, where he would spend his remaining years among other prisoners convicted of serious crimes. In interviews conducted after his conviction, Webb expressed remorse for his actions and acknowledged that living with guilt had been its own form of imprisonment long before his formal incarceration. Whether this remorse was genuine or performative remained a matter of interpretation. Michael Patterson, who had orchestrated the murders and escaped earthly justice through his death in 2008, left behind a legacy of destruction. His widow returned the proceeds from his estate to compensate the Coleman family, a gesture that provided some financial redress but could never truly address the magnitude of what had been taken from them. The truth about December 18, 1991, had finally emerged from the shadows where it had hidden for nearly a quarter century. Two people had left their gas station that night, trusting someone they believed was offering them an opportunity. They had walked toward a vehicle in the darkness, carrying their hopes for the future in a small overnight bag. They never returned, and their absence had created a wound in their family and community that time alone could not heal. But resolution had come at last, carried forward by dedication, technology, and the simple fact that evidence, properly preserved and examined, could speak across decades. The case of Robert and Jennifer Coleman closed officially in August 2016, 24 years and 8 months after it began, a testament to the possibility that truth, however long delayed, could still emerge, and justice, however imperfect and incomplete, could still be served. The security tape that captured their final moments at the gas station had been their last testimony, a silent witness that waited patiently in darkness until someone finally looked closely enough to see what it had been trying to show all along. In that grainy, restored footage lay the key to unlocking a mystery that had persisted longer than many of the investigators who worked on it had been in their careers. And so the Coleman case entered the archives as solved, a cold case that had found its resolution through persistence, technology, and the convergence of circumstances that allowed the truth to finally surface after lying buried, both literally and figuratively, for nearly a quarter of a century.